Thalia Brennan did not look up from her plate. Not when Ambrose pushed back his chair at the Aldermason dinner, with the slow, deliberate scrape of a man who wanted the room to feel his weight before he spoke. Not when the conversation around the table thinned and then stopped. The way conversation always stopped when Ambrose Brennan decided he had something to say and required an audience for it. Not when she felt Mrs. Brennan's settle on her from across the table like a hand pressing down on her shoulder. Thalia picked up her dessert fork. She took a careful bite of the syllabub. Ambrose addressed the table. He spoke of the demands placed upon a man of his position. He spoke of the railroad contracts, the civic responsibilities, the particular rigor required of a household that represented not merely a family but a commercial enterprise of considerable public consequence. He spoke, in the practiced cadence of a man who had measured every word before uttering it, of the regrettable truth that his current domestic arrangement had proven, and here he paused, just long enough, unsuited to those demands. The table understood. Thalia could feel it in the quality of the silence. 12 well-dressed people discovering that their presence had been required for a purpose they hadn't anticipated, and were now obligated to witness. She set down her fork. She folded her hands in her lap. She looked at her husband of 2 years, at the composed, self-satisfied face of a man who had decided the outcome of this evening weeks ago and was simply completing the delivery. And she understood something she had been carefully not understanding for some time. Ambrose Brennan had never intended to keep her. He had intended to use her, and now he intended to put her aside with the same clean efficiency with which he managed his railroad accounts, publicly, so no one could later claim he had been secretive about it, without cruelty, so no one could later claim he had been unkind. She didn't say anything. She did not make a scene. She had been raised in a physician's house, and physicians' daughters learned early that the worst thing you could do in a crisis was make more of one. She thanked Mrs. Aldermason for the syllabub. She said it was the best she'd had all season. She meant it. The carriage home was silent. Their marriage had been arranged in the spring of 1880, when Thalia's father, Dr. Emmett Ormsby, a Philadelphia physician of modest income and considerable intellectual achievement, was dying slowly and knew it. Dr. Ormsby had spent the better part of a decade developing an antiseptic compound for the treatment of infected wounds, the kind of injuries railroad laborers sustained by the dozen every season. He had patented it 2 years before his diagnosis. He had not, in those 2 years, managed to find a commercial partner willing to produce it at scale. Ambrose Brennan had come to him not as a patient but as a proposition. He had offered financial support for Dr. Ormsby's remaining practice. He had offered security for Thalia. He had spoken of his admiration for the work, his conviction that the compound would transform field medicine, his intention to see it properly brought to market. Dr. Ormsby had believed him. He was a good man, Thalia's father. He trusted what people showed him. It was the quality she had always loved most in him, and the one that had most regularly cost him. Thalia had believed Ambrose, too, in the way you believed things when you were 22 and frightened, and someone offered you a clear path through a situation that had no other clear paths. She hadn't loved Ambrose. She had known that plainly from the first evening he called. But, she had thought, and this was the thing she would think about most, afterward, she had thought that a man who spoke so carefully and moved so deliberately would at least be honest about the terms. She had been wrong about what honesty meant to him. The weeks after the Aldermason dinner were not dramatically unpleasant. That, Thalia came to understand, was part of the design. Ambrose was not cruel in the obvious way. He did not raise his voice. He simply withdrew. His presence, his conversation, his acknowledgement of her as a person who occupied the same rooms as himself, with the unhurried efficiency of a man decommissioning a piece of equipment that had served its purpose. The social withdrawal was more textured. Invitations that had previously included her name began arriving without it. Women who had spoken to her warmly at church found reasons to look past her shoulder during the exchange of pleasantries after service. The city's particular machinery of exclusion operated through glances and scheduling conflicts, and the carefully maintained fiction that nothing deliberate was happening at all, merely that people were busy, that the season was complicated, that these things had a way of sorting themselves out. Hilda Caro came to call on a Thursday in October. Hilda Caro was 56 years old, twice widowed, and operated a prosperous dry goods import business from offices on Chestnut Street that the city had spent several years attempting to ignore and had ultimately been forced to respect. She had known Dr. Ormsby for 30 years. She had attended his funeral with the same composed, practical grief she brought to everything. Full of feeling, entirely without performance. She had watched Thalia's marriage with the quiet attention of a woman who had survived enough to know what she was looking at. She arrived without a note. She sat down without being invited to. She waved off the offer of tea and looked at Thalia across the parlor with the direct, unsparing regard of a woman who did not believe in circling a thing when you could simply name it. "He's planning to remarry," Hilda said. "A widow from Germantown, name of Packard. Her late husband had rail interests in the Western lines, the ones Ambrose has been trying to extend his contracts into for 3 years." Thalia was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to come tell you before someone else did." Hilda folded her hands in her lap. "Or before no one did, which was the more likely outcome." "And my father's compound?" Thalia said. "Patent?" "That's the question I'd put to a lawyer," Hilda said, "before you put it to anyone else." Ansel Mace had handled estate matters for the Ormsby family since Dr. Ormsby first established his practice on Pine Street, which made him one of the few people in Philadelphia who knew every particular of what the doctor had owned when he died, what he'd owed, and what had become of both. He was a small, unhurried man with a habit of reading documents twice before he spoke about them, and he received Thalia in his office on a gray November morning with the careful, leveled courtesy of a man who had been given context he wasn't sure how to present. She saved him the trouble of figuring out how. "I want to understand the patent," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "My father's antiseptic compound. The licensing arrangement Ambrose has in place with the railroad companies. I want to understand what that arrangement is, precisely, and what legal standing I have with respect to it." Mace was quiet. "He's been licensing it," Thalia said. "I know that much. What I don't know is whether he had the right to." Mace looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached for the file he had pulled before she arrived, which told her he had been expecting this conversation, or something near it, for some time. "The patent," he said carefully, "was registered in your father's name in the spring of 1878. When your father died, it passed by inheritance to his estate." He set the file on the desk between them. "The transfer of intellectual property rights to a spouse requires specific documentation. A separate assignment. Your father signed a letter of intent regarding the compound in October of 1879, 6 months before your marriage." Thalia looked at him. "But the letter of intent is not an assignment," Mace said. "It expressed Dr. Ormsby's wish that the compound be developed commercially in partnership with Mr. Brennan." He paused. "It does not transfer legal ownership of the patent. That transfer was never completed." The room was very quiet. "You're telling me," Thalia said, "that Ambrose has been licensing a patent he doesn't legally own?" "I'm telling you," Mace said, "that the patent passed to the Ormsby estate, and that you are the primary heir of that estate, and that no legal instrument was ever executed to change that fact." He held her gaze. "What Mr. Brennan has represented to the railroad companies regarding his authority to license that compound is a matter I would want to examine considerably more carefully before I characterized it." "Give me a week," Thalia said. He gave her 2. She spent those 2 weeks learning things she had not known how to know before. She learned that Ambrose had entered into licensing agreements with 3 railroad companies, collecting quarterly fees that he had recorded in his own accounts and never disclosed to the Ormsby estate. She learned that he had represented himself in those agreements as the holder of the patent by right of his marriage, a claim that Mace, upon reviewing the documentation, said was not supported by any instrument he could locate in either county's records. She also had her father's notes on the compound, all of them, the early experiments, the failed batches, the years of adjustment, the final formula that had taken him the better part of a decade to arrive at. She had spent her childhood in his study while he worked, handing him instruments and recording his observations. Because he said her handwriting was cleaner than his, and she was more careful about fractions. She understood the compound better than anyone alive, and those men manufacturing it had been working from a formula Ambrose had given them. A formula that, when she compared it carefully to her father's notes, was missing a step. A small step. One that didn't affect the compound's basic function, but would, over time, affect its stability under high-temperature conditions. The kind of conditions present in the American Southwest, where 2 of the 3 railroad lines operated. She wrote to her father's former colleague, Dr. Weston at the university, and asked him to review the discrepancy. He confirmed it within a week. She added his assessment to the file. Then she waited, the way she had gotten good at waiting. Not idly, not passively, but with the focused patience of someone who understood that gathering was its own kind of action. She talked with Hilda again, not about what to do, she was already forming that, but about how. If someone were to bring a concern about the patent licensing to the attention of the railroad companies, Thalia said one afternoon in Hilda's office on Chestnut Street, how would a woman do that without it appearing to be anything other than a straightforward legal correction? Hilda considered this with the patience of a woman who had spent 30 years conducting commerce in a city that preferred she didn't. Through their legal counsel, she said, if someone were to have Mace prepare a formal letter, setting out the question of patent ownership with supporting documentation, and send it to each company's board, not making accusations, simply raising questions that the evidence raised on its own, they would ask their own lawyers to look into it. She paused. And lawyers, when they look into something, tend to find what's actually there. Thalia went home. She spent 4 evenings writing letters with Mace. Careful letters, precise letters, letters that asked no one to believe anything except what the patent records and estate documents plainly showed. She sent them. She waited. The first indication that things were moving came from Mace, on a Wednesday afternoon in December. The Hartfield Railroad's legal counsel, he said, has been in contact. They've pulled the original licensing agreement and they're asking questions about the assignment documentation. He paused. Specifically, they're asking for the instrument by which Mr. Brennan acquired the license. He looked at her. He hasn't been able to produce one. Because there isn't one, Thalia said. Because there isn't one, Mace agreed. The letter surfaced in January. It came from the Packard brother, the railroad board member whose sister Ambrose had intended to marry. He had retained his own attorney to review the licensing agreements once the questions began. And that attorney, in pulling Ambrose's correspondence file from the initial contract negotiations, had found a letter Ambrose had written to his personal solicitor in the autumn of 1879. Before the wedding, before Dr. Ormsby had died. The Packard brother sent a copy to Mace. Mace brought it to Thalia on a Thursday morning and sat across from her desk while she read it. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first outlined the commercial opportunity, represented by Dr. Ormsby's compound, and the railroad health contracts that would follow from controlling it. The second laid out the mechanism, the marriage, the letter of intent, the assumption that the patent would transfer without complication. The third paragraph read, in part, the girl herself will not be a difficulty. Ormsby's health will not sustain another 2 years. Once he is gone and the girl is settled under my roof, the practical management of the matter becomes straightforward. Her father trusts me. She will follow his example. Thalia read the paragraph twice. She set the letter on the desk. She looked at the window. She looked at her hands. She looked at the file Mace had assembled, the estate documents, the patent records, the correspondence with the railroad boards, the assessment from Dr. Weston about the formula. Her father trusts me. Dr. Emmett Ormsby, who had taught her to record observations accurately and check her fractions twice, who had believed that a man who spoke carefully and moved deliberately was a man worth trusting. Her father had been read by Ambrose Brennan the way Ambrose read everything, as a condition to be managed, as a variable to be resolved. She did not cry. She had known for some time that she was not going to cry about Ambrose Brennan. She looked at Mace. Send it to the other 2 railroad companies, she said. Their counsel should have it. And send a copy to Dr. Weston's department at the university. The formula discrepancy is a separate matter, but they're connected. She paused. The people who need accurate information should have it. Mace picked up the letter. Miss Ormsby, he said, and it was the first time in 2 years he had used her maiden name, though she understood it was not accidental, for what it's worth. You have handled this with more precision than most attorneys I know. I had a good teacher, she said. She meant her father. Mace understood that. She was at her father's old desk on Pine Street. She had kept the house. It was hers by the estate when Ambrose knocked. She had been expecting him for several days. He had the precise timing of a man who prided himself on never appearing rattled, and appearing rattled was what he had been doing, according to Hilda, since the second railroad company suspended its payments in February. He looked diminished, not destroyed, still well-dressed, still carrying himself with the posture of a Brennan, but diminished in the way a man looked when the architecture of his certainty had been pulled out from under him, and he hadn't yet decided what to replace it with. Thalia, he said. She held the door without opening it further. I know you were involved, he said. His voice was level. She could hear what it cost him to keep it that way. I shared estate documents with legal counsel, she said. The same documents anyone could have requested from the county records. She kept her voice pleasant. Is there something specific you'd like to discuss? The Hartfield contract is voided. He looked at her steadily. The other two are under review. The Packard family has withdrawn entirely. He paused. You've been thorough. The patent belongs to the Ormsby estate, she said. That's a fact. It was always a fact. I simply made sure the relevant parties were aware of it. A pause stretched between them. You arranged a marriage, she said, to access a patent you knew you didn't have legal right to. She kept her voice quiet, completely, entirely quiet. You wrote a letter calling my father's trust an asset to be exploited, and calling me a difficulty to be managed. She held his gaze. You did those things, Ambrose. The consequences belong to them. He had nothing to say to that. They both knew it was true. Go home, she said. Make whatever arrangements the situation requires. That's my advice, for whatever it's worth coming from me. He put his hat back on. He looked at her for a long moment, the specific belated comprehension of a man who had decided a woman's worth and discovered, too late, that he had calculated wrong. He left. She stood in the doorway and watched the street until it was empty. Then she went back inside. It was Hilda who told her about Quentin Strand. He was a physician by training, a patent attorney by necessity, after an injury ended his surgical career, and he had spent the past 3 years building a practice around medical innovation licensing, helping physicians and researchers navigate the particular thicket of documentation and commercial law that Thalia had just spent 6 months learning entirely on her own. He'd heard about the Ormsby compound from Dr. Weston at the university, Hilda said. He wants to discuss the formula correction and what it means for the patent's commercial scope. She gave Thalia a very steady look. I told him you would know more about it than anyone else alive, which is true. Hilda, Thalia said. What exactly did you tell him about me? Enough, Hilda said, to make him ask to be introduced properly. He came on a Tuesday afternoon in March, when the light was finally starting to come back into the city after a long gray winter. He was dark-haired, quieter than his profession typically produced, and he came to the point of the meeting, the patent, the formula discrepancy, the commercial implications, with the organized, careful efficiency of someone who had read everything available before arriving and wanted to make sure she knew he had. He asked her 3 questions. She answered them. He asked a 4th that revealed he had understood her answer to the 3rd, more completely than she'd expected. She revised her initial assessment of him upward. You wrote the Mace letters yourself, he said after a while. Not as a statement, he was checking. I did, she said. He was quiet for a moment. The formula assessment as well? I consulted Dr. Weston, but yes. Strand looked at her with the particular attention of a man who had walked in expecting one thing and was finding another. Not surprise. A recalibration, like a man correcting a measurement. The compound, he said slowly. With the stability correction and the updated formula, the commercial scope of this patent is considerably larger than what Brennan's agreements captured. He looked at his notes. If someone were to approach the railroad companies now, with the corrected formula and a properly documented licensing framework, the terms available would be substantially different from what existed before. He looked up. I'd like to propose a working arrangement, he said, a formal one, with a written agreement. My practice handles the legal side, documentation, negotiations, contract review. He paused. You handle the substance, the formula, the yield assessments, the commercial analysis. He held her gaze. 50-50 on the licensing administration fee. Equal standing in every discussion. Thalia looked at him. Why 50-50? Because you're doing half the work, he said. Probably more. He said it without qualification, without the slightly performative fairness of a man who wanted credit for being reasonable, just as a fact. She looked at the window. She thought about the letter. The girl herself will not be a difficulty, and she thought about what the preceding 2 years had actually required of her, the precision, the patience, the long, quiet accumulation of knowledge in a city that had preferred she didn't accumulate it. She thought that she did not need Quentin Strand's arrangement. She had built enough on her own to proceed without it. She thought that this was precisely the reason she was inclined to consider it. He had come with specifics. He had quoted equal terms without being asked. He had read Weston's assessment and understood it. He had not, at any point in the conversation, looked at her the way Ambrose had, like a ledger entry, like a variable to be resolved. "Give me 3 days," she said. "I'll review the proposed arrangement and come back to you with questions." He nodded. "That's more than fair." At the door he paused. "Miss Ormsby," he said. She had gone back to using her maiden name, professionally and otherwise, and apparently Hilda had mentioned this. "I want to say something. What you did with the Brennan situation, keeping it factual, staying inside the legal record, letting the documentation do what documentation does on its own." He stopped. "I've seen men with formal legal training handle those circumstances less cleanly." "I had reason to be careful," she said. "You had reason to be angry," he said. "The fact that you were careful instead, that's not a small thing." She held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you," she said. It was all she said. It was enough. By spring, the Ormsby patent had been properly re-licensed to 2 of the original railroad companies under corrected terms. The third was under review following a merger, and Mace was participating on the estate's behalf, with Strand managing the technical documentation. The fees were not enormous. They were real. They were hers, in the way she had come to understand ownership. Not by assumption or a man's letter of intent, but by the daily work of understanding what a thing was worth, and refusing to let anyone tell her otherwise. Ambrose left Philadelphia in April. He went to Chicago, where he had distant associates, and no one who had been at the Aldermason dinner. He went quietly, without announcement, without performance. Thalia heard it from Hilda, who had heard it from his former housekeeper. She was at her father's desk when Hilda told her. She set down her pen. She let the news settle into its proper place, not as a wound, not as a victory, just as a fact. A man had made choices. The choices had carried him somewhere west. That was all. She thought, briefly, about hoping. He found something better than what he'd been in Philadelphia. She thought it in the impersonal way you hoped things for strangers, without attachment to whether he did. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. Hilda came for tea on Thursdays now. It had become a fixed arrangement that neither of them mentioned as a fixed arrangement, because Hilda would have found that sentimental. In October, she arrived with a kind of stillness that meant she had something to say, and had already decided how. "Strand has been asking after you," Hilda said, without preamble. "Not about the patent." She picked up her cup. "He asked me last week whether you had received the letter he sent in September." Thalia looked at her. "What letter?" "The one he sent in September," Hilda said, with the mild patience of a woman waiting for arithmetic to resolve. "He inquired after your professional situation, and then, at the end, he inquired after your situation personally, whether you had recovered what you'd lost, whether there was anything you needed. And you didn't tell me." "You were busy," Hilda said serenely. Thalia looked at the window. She thought about the conversation in March, the questions he'd asked, the way he'd listened to the answers, the fact that he'd come with equal terms, written into the first draft of the proposal, without being asked for them. She thought about the way he'd stood in the doorway and said you had reason to be angry, as if he already knew the difference between anger and spite, and considered it worth naming. She thought that she had spent 2 years learning the cost of trusting without looking carefully, and that looking carefully was precisely what she had been doing since March, and that the evidence, read honestly, pointed consistently in one direction. She picked up her pen and wrote to Quentin Strand that evening. She thanked him for the September letter, which she had not received, but which she assumed said something worth responding to. She told him the patent situation was stable, and she expected the Chicago merger review to conclude favorably before the new year. And then, in the last paragraph, she told him that she had been thinking about his question, whether there was anything she needed, and that what she needed, she was increasingly certain, was not a rescue or an arrangement, but a person who had read what she'd written carefully enough to understand what she meant. "If that description fits," she wrote, "I would like to know." His reply came in 2 days. "It fits," he wrote, "completely." Hilda, who had somehow obtained the intelligence before Thalia mentioned it, arrived on Thursday with very good cake from the bakery on Walnut Street, and the composed expression of a woman who had already known how the arithmetic would resolve and was allowing herself a moment of satisfaction. "Don't say anything," Thalia told her. "I wasn't going to say a word," Hilda said, and ate her cake with great serenity. Outside, Philadelphia moved through its October business. The carriages on Chestnut Street, the lamplight beginning to come on in the early dark, the wide, indifferent city doing what cities always did. And, in her father's study, At her father's desk, surrounded by his notes and her account books, and the accumulated evidence of a year spent learning the precise difference between what a person was told they were worth and what they actually were, Thalia Ormsby picked up her pen. There was still a great deal of work to do. She had never been more certain of anything in her life than the knowledge that she was exactly the right person to do it.